the most vocal folks around that first book were not CIOs or chief digital or data officers. It was really people aspiring to be those leadership roles. And so I said, well, what do I call these people? And that's where the term digital trailblazers came from.
Technology is transforming how we think, how we lead, and how we win. From Intervision, this is Status Go, the show helping IT leaders move beyond the status quo, master their craft, and propel their IT vision.
Welcome to Status Go. Since we launched this podcast almost 4 years ago, we have explored digital transformation and other great topics from many different perspectives. Going in our Wayback Machine to our second episode, we interviewed author and thought leader Isaac Sacolick about his book, Driving Digital. I'm really excited to welcome Isaac back to Status Go to talk about his new book, Digital Trailblazer, Essential Lessons to Jumpstart Transformation and Accelerate Your Technology Leadership. Using stories from his own experience that I know will resonate with our listeners when you hear some of these, Isaac guides us through 10 traits or skills you need to hone to enable you to drive transformation at your organization. Isaac, welcome back to Status Go, man.
Jeff, thank you for having me. It's great. I didn't actually know it was the second episode, so I'm thrilled to hear that you're still going with this,
Absolutely.
and your intro is great, and I can't wait to talk to you about transformation and leadership and practices wherever you want to go around the book and just things that I'm knowledgeable about.
Awesome. Well, I think you'll be, I think this episode will be like 180, 181. So almost 180
Wow.
episodes after we did the first one. So, and I know that your first book, Driving Digital, did really well from a book sales perspective. I know many people around the Midwest, which is where I'm from, have read it and have used what is in it to drive transformation in their organizations. So I can't wait to dive into Digital Trailblazers. Before we get to that, though, Isaac, how about a little bit of your background? Just share a little bit. Episode 2, episode 180. There's a lot of time in between there. People might have forgotten a little bit. So give us a little bit of your journey.
Sure. I'm going to give you two tracks to my career in simple, quick terms. My professional track, which I was a CTO in startups for about a decade, including a media startup, which really gave me sort of my front row seat to disruption happening in newspapers and magazines. I then pivoted my career. I'm on the East Coast. Back then, startup, East Coast just wasn't an easy chemistry. I wasn't ready to move to the West Coast back then. So I pivoted and started working for enterprises that said to me, Isaac, we need to enable data and technology and customer experiences as a strategic advantage. Can you bring startup like practices, startup like leadership to our enterprises? And I'm like, well, that's interesting. And different. I'm like, you sure you know what you're signing up for? So I took a job as the CIO at Business Week magazine, and then later the CIO at a construction data company that's now called Dodge Data and Analytics. I then went to my third role at a financial services analytics company, and that was another decade of just taking existing business models, existing products and services, upgrading them, changing the experiences. And then in the middle of that, I had my second career going in parallel, and I didn't know it was going to be a career. Somebody said to me during a startup, Isaac, your startup, your travel social network is great, but it's not plugged into the blogosphere. And I took that comment way too literally. I started writing a blog back in 2005. It has almost 600 blog posts on it now. I also write for CIO, for InfoWorld, for Enterprisers Project, a bunch of other websites. So my career writing started back in 2005. My career speaking started in 2010. And, lo and behold, I put that all together back in 2017 Driving Digital came out then. I started my business, Star CIO, back then. Star CIO, we really help companies and leaders who are trying to drive transformation. We have a whole center of excellence program around agile and DevOps and becoming data driven. Just came out with my second book, and that's just what I do. I just am a thought leader. I try to share as much as I know, and really enjoy being here, Jeff, to talk to you about it.
That's awesome, and I think I was trying to remember this morning how you and I connected, and I think it was through your blog. I think I started following you. There was a list of CIOs you need to follow on Twitter or something like that,
Yep.
and started following you there and reading your blogs, and really found them so insightful. And that's one of the things I love about Digital Trailblazer, is because your stories reminded me so much of stories that I experienced, and I know many of our listeners will too. So let's dive into the book a little bit. Why was this the topic you chose for book number 2? Why Digital Trailblazer?
Yeah, that's a great question, but let me roll back because that wasn't the original intent.
Okay, okay.
Okay. When I started writing this, um, my objective was just to start writing stories down. And I didn't know where it was going to go. You know this, Jeff, because you've written your own books. It's sort of like running a marathon. You do it once, you go through the entire, exercise, the entire running, the pain after the run, and then somewhere in there you're like, I got to go run the marathon again.
Uh-huh.
I got to go
Uh-huh.
do the. I'm not a marathon run. I do century bike rides, and it's like, oh, I'm ready to do the next one.
Yeah, let me do the
And
next one.
and so that's how it started. Just started writing stories down and sharing some of those stories with some people to see, are these relevant or even interesting? Should I do anything with this? And I started creating a collection of them before the pandemic. This was like Christmas time 2019, and I'm looking at these stories, and people are asking me, Isaac, when's the next book coming out? When's the next book coming out? And so I made a conscious effort, even before the pandemic, saying I'm going to get another book out in 2020.
Mhm.
Okay. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and I talk about that story in the book.
Mhm.
But part of the way I got to finishing it was I had more time on my hands to really think through, how am I going to create a cohesive storyline around these stories. And so I figured that out. And the next part of the journey was, well, how do I make it useful? And so rather than leaving it up to the reader to figure out, why am I telling my 9/11 story, or why am I
Mhm.
telling my story about bringing agile into the enterprise, I better spell it out for people. And so I started putting out my lessons learned after that. And so now I had 10 chapters, 50 lessons learned. And then, as you know, then you start doing the important things like, okay, who's the target audience?
It's
And
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and what are you going to call this thing for real? That's what the working title. Working title was leading transformation,
Uh,
was the working title. And then, what does the cover look like? And things like that. And I really homed in on one of the stories that I told in the book about just me dealing with the stress of being a leader, dealing with all the things that you have to keep inside, and then recognizing one of the things that I found on my journey after Digital Trailblazer came out. The most vocal folks around that first book were not CIOs or chief digital or data officers. It was really people aspiring to be those leadership
mhm.
roles. And they were coming from different disciplines: product management, data scientists, DevOps engineers, and developers and testers. And they said, look, we understand our narrow lens of where we're coming from. We may or may not aspire to be a C level one day, but we really don't know how to navigate our career.
Mhm.
And so I said, well, what do I call these people? And that's where the term digital trailblazers came from. And it's really anybody who is aspiring to be a transformation leader, continuous learning, understand how to build your depth and breadth of your skill set, and recognizing, what? You may not have ever been in front of a board, or you've never been in a shock and awe moment, or had to make a business case for something. So before you ever have to live through that experience, I told mine. And Jeff, you know this. Some of my stories were winning stories, and some of them were not. Not so much winners. And I, I share them for what they are because they're learning experiences.
That's awesome, and because it is so personal, you're putting yourself out there, right? And you've been doing that for years through your speaking and your other writing, but to have that personal story out there, I'd love to talk through some of the stories, uh, some of the lessons. I don't want to take away the thunder because I want everybody listening to go out and buy the book. It's
Hmm.
fantastic. I read it over a weekend. It's a really it's one of those books that you, as a former IT leader myself, it's hard to put down because you're waiting to figure out what's coming next. So I think our leaders will experience that as well. When you talk about the being on the top floor of that in the boardroom, what was the question? What did you get asked? And then talk a little bit about what you did.
Yeah. I mean, the real context there, I mean, I was in my 20s and I had done board meetings that were much smaller scale. They were in our office. Yeah, the VCs wanted to throw darts at us, but it was sort of disconnected. When you're that young, and this is in the 90s. This was before startups and were really mainstream. Before VCs really knew how to throw the darts and the tomatoes at the founders. We had strategic investors who came in. These were the old guard of media, right? And
Uh,
this was, the top floor of a major magazine powerhouse. And you'd ride up the elevator to that floor and you would see the fashion magazine and you would see the technical magazine and you could kind of generalize who's working on what area.
mm-hmm.
These are people who've made fortunes in the old guard of advertising and the power lunches and all those things. And I was just at the tip of the iceberg of it. And quite frankly, I didn't have a clue of what I was doing going into this to this board meeting. I had presented before, but this was a group of people who could sit for 4 or 5 hours in a board meeting hashing things through, and they were learning, right? They knew the web was going to be something new. They were
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure it out for themselves. We were the young kids on the block trying to say digital is everything,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Print will be dead and you better go do all this stuff, and we were arrogant at the time. But my CEO is very specific with me going into this saying, you're there for support. You don't have a speaking role. You know, you don't need to jump in. Just learn and listen. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, okay. And we were presenting a product at the time that was pre AdSense. We were placing ads on multiple websites, and we were doing that through early stage JavaScript, early stage cookies, all the things that you sort of can do now, but there's ad networks to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to explain it to the media without getting into any of the technical jargon. And of course, the head of sales says, we're going to go place ads on your websites. And the head of the board looks at him and says, well, how are you going to do that? And he just blurts out, we're going to go cookie the users. And the head of the advert, another board member looks at around and says, what's a cookie? And of course, nobody really knows the answer
Yes,
except
sir.
I do. And I got to find a creative way of answering this
Mm-hmm.
uh, without going down the rabbit hole of how browsers work and how servers work and what
Uh,
stateless machines are. And that's the story I tell in the book.
yeah, yeah. I love that because I can just feel the eyes turn to you, right, when they raise that. What's a cookie? The other thing I love about the book, Isaac, is your chapter titles are very creative, and one of them that jumped out at me even before I read the book, and it's even more so now, is wearing the CEO's Diet Coke. So, talk to me about wearing the CEO's Diet Coke.
Okay, yeah. So, of the stories in the book, that chapter is by far my favorite. I think I can critique myself on, staying in person first narrative versus, trying to tell the story versus trying to share the lesson. I think I
Mhm.
was most successful in that chapter. And it's because they were very real stories to me.
Mhm.
They were the things that for us old timers, we talk about the days before cloud, the days when development was really difficult to do, which is still difficult today. Operations had its own difficulties in terms of just managing data centers and networks and storages systems. And, everybody in technology, we had our own vernacular, right? We
Mhm.
had our own drivers, we had our own KPIs and our own metrics and our own ways of doing things. And here comes now the web, and now all of a sudden, building apps and customer experiences and doing things with data is not just something that tech companies are doing. We're starting to become a SaaS company, and we're starting to build this out on consumer websites. And now things that only technology companies used to have to figure out, now lots of companies have to figure out. So, wearing the CEO's Diet Coke, this was essentially a story of an outage, and as a classic finger pointing outage between the knock on my side, the developers on my side, and the colo and the network provider that we were working with.
Mhm.
And Jeff, you know this. Our network operations leaders back then had to be. Can I say this on? They had to be ball busters.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
can I
Uh-huh.
say that? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
we'll let
it's
it
just what
go.
it was.
Sure.
Let it go. I mean, if you read my book and you got past
You'll
the first
know.
word,
Yes,
but
yes,
I
yes.
use colorful language at times, and no disrespect to people. It's just it is what it is.
Mhm.
But if you were network operations and you were getting hammered every time there was an outage, and chances are it wasn't anything you did, all right, you had to essentially beat people over the head to come back
Yep.
and say, prove to me it's not in your court.
Yep.
And to do that, sometimes you have to use even more colorful language. And
Mhm.
quite frankly, CEOs aren't always used to that.
Uh-huh.
And, and so
Uh-huh.
that's how I got to end up wearing the CEO's Diet Coke, as he heard my network operations swearing at the data center folks, and in more language than I care to share on a website.
Yes. Yeah.
You're gonna have to go read through that,
Read the
but
book.
it was very real. It was very true, and he just spit it all over the place when he
Yeah.
heard it. And I had to tell that story with a little sensitivity for a couple of reasons. One is because I wanted people to learn from it,
Mhm.
right? Some of the behaviors back then aren't appropriate. We know this today. And
Yep.
I felt like I probably should have done a better job calling it out at the time. And I'm very forefront in that chapter calling
Yeah.
it out. It also is a kind of a prelude to some of the things that still exist today. The stress that
Mhm.
people in operations feel trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep things humming along. In some ways, systems are more complex today than they ever were. We were dealing with 2 and 3 tier systems, and network storage, and they have their complexities to them. But now I've got microservices, and I've got Kubernetes, and I've got more security issues than we can name on this podcast. Thousands of things can go wrong, and they're feeling the stress of it.
Mhm.
And that stress was felt by my team and by that leader, and it did not have a happy and healthy ending. And I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah.
I hope
Yeah.
and tremendous lessons for me to learn around that, and for others to learn around that.
Well, and I love that kind of segue. It's like you're used to doing these interviews because you segued right into my next thing, Isaac, which is this book is more than just the great stories. It's the lessons behind the stories. And as an author myself, I love looking at other authors' books and the way they structure them. And for our listeners, when you pick up a copy of this book, you'll see that Isaac does kind of the structure of each chapter is these stories, and he goes through, and you're learning the lessons as you're going through, listening to the stories and his reflection on them. But then he calls out at the end of the chapter, here's the lessons, right? So very explicit, here's the lessons. And then even at the end of the book, you detail all the lessons. So you've got this almost handy tear out sheet of
Yes.
here's the lessons, right, that you've had. So as you're thinking about the book, I'm going to put you on the spot. I think you said there's 50 lessons throughout the book. What was your favorite?
Oh, wow, that's a stumper. I think I'm going to go back to the very first, I think it's the first lesson in the book in the first chapter about how important it is to get out of your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can apply that to a CIO who has been in their career for 10, 15 years and has, done the playbook 4 or 5 times over, walks into a new organization. And if you don't listen and learn who the markets are, who the customers are, what are the opportunities, where's the market moving in that industry, what's the current culture look like, what does the future culture need to be, what are your skills, and so forth. If you just take your playbook and reapply it and stamp it out somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
not going to work. Get out of your comfort zone. You got to relearn it. Okay. I then think back to that first time you're really given that the reins over something. You're your first time CIO, or maybe you're leading M&A for the first time and you have this major acquisition that you're trying to put together, or maybe like you finally had the guts to go sell an innovation program and you got money and a team to go do this.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're like, I have this great blog post where I pull the snippet from Finding Nemo, and they do all this planning to get to the ocean, and they're in the water, in the bag, and they're floating in the water. And I think it's Puffer that says, "Now what?"
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You've done all the work to get to a point, and you're now figuring it out, saying, "Oh, I don't know what comes next."
Yeah.
So, what really comes next is getting out of your comfort zone and saying, "Okay, I got to learn and figure this out. Where's this journey taking me?" And then third use case, go back in earlier in your career. And I love doing this when I was doing and when I still do workshops, and I can see people who have natural leadership abilities. They ask questions, they're trying to learn on the fly, they have no preconceived notions. They kind of leave their job titles behind. So
Mm-hmm.
they might be product managers, or they might be in marketing or operations, but they're very inquisitive about the end-to-end picture. And at some point, they're going to leave their comfort zone and try doing something somewhere else so that they can learn from it. And maybe it's the engineer who's going to go on a roadshow and learn how customers are using their product because they've never seen it before. Or maybe it's the marketer who isn't going to rely on a scientist to chug on their data anymore. They're going to go pick up a self-service BI tool and learn how to use it. So
Mm-hmm.
that story is so important, and it just permeates throughout the book. So
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right. It does permeate throughout the book. It keeps coming back. The other thing that has been on my mind lately, I've been involved in a couple of programs here in Indianapolis on culture. And
mm.
you talk about culture from the perspective of a digital trailblazer. Talk to us a little bit about that and why culture plays a role as a digital trailblazer.
Yeah, I'm going to jump back over to some themes in the later chapters, chapter 9 and 10. You talk about culture, and I talked about my board meetings, sitting in front of people who are kind of used to making their money doing a certain way, having the business run a certain way, seeing profit margins coming in a certain way. And now you're looking at this and say, well, this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
you
What
know
is
the
this?
Okay, so we have a catalog, and now we're doing a website, and then we're doing a mobile site. And guess what? I'm not going to tell you whether the metaverse is going to be here in 1, 3, or 5 or 10 years. It's going to be somewhere on that spectrum.
Hmm.
And you can bet media is going to get disrupted. You can bet retail is going to get disrupted. I think there's huge opportunities in healthcare, in construction, and manufacturing. You're sitting there and you're starting to look at what's happening because you're, I don't know, you like the technology, you're playing around with it. And you're saying, well, how do I convince this group that we're going to do something different over here? That's a
Mhm.
culture statement, right?
Yeah.
How are
Yeah.
you going to convince the group that you need resources, you need a team, you need dollars, you need room to fail, all that kind of stuff, so you can start experimenting with a new way of delivering your product or service. And then you think about what I talk about in chapter 10, digital transformation. The reason we're still talking about it is because it really doesn't end. There's
Right.
going to
Right.
be new waves of what customers want. We have supply chain issues facing a lot of companies right now. Sustainability is a real opportunity and a real issue. We have talent that's, whether you want to call it the resignation or quiet quitters or
Hmm.
global expansion or decent. I mean, lots of things happening depending on where you are with staffing and skill sets. And I could tell you the easy part of any transformation is getting the early adopters,
Hmm.
right? This is why, startups can go from zero to like liftoff pretty quickly because you find some early adopters, you sell them on the value proposition. You naturally find them, they're totally interested in this, but
Hmm.
now you got to take it mainstream. You got to go from 10 people to 100 people in your company supporting you to 1,000 people in your company supporting you. You're not getting to the detractors, which I talk about in the book, but you're dealing with that middle group that's just, I want to come in and do 3 or 4 things on my day and then go home for the night. And you need them involved. They're subject matter experts.
Yeah.
They have a lot of expertise, a lot of ideas, and that's culture. How do you get them to give and provide feedback? How do you get them to double up? And I'm not just talking about hours, I'm talking about double up in their energy
Hmm.
to do today's work and then participate in what the future is going to look like.
Yeah.
When you come to them and say, hey, we're going to invest time to learn a new technology, and you and I know this, when you learn something that's part of the job, you're not going to just be able to learn it in your 40 hours that they're paying you. You're going to have to
Right.
extend into your personal life to do this at different times. Are you going to step up and do those things? And then are you going to go out and apply it? All that becomes part of culture. And then you
Hmm.
start getting into, things I talk about in chapter 8. What does it really mean to form diverse teams? How do you create your leadership team? What does it mean to be inclusive? So you hear people's opinion,
Hmm.
but then also recognize that at some point you got to make some decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think you alluded to this a little bit as well, and you talk about it in the book, uh, influencing decision makers. What are some of the skills or the traits that our digital trailblazers need to influence the decision makers to get things started in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to throw out some hints here without necessarily orchestrating an algorithm for you. I recently did a blog post and a video about establishing relationships
Hmm.
with stakeholders, and there's two parts to it. There's the how do I even get to know somebody who's going to be a decision maker? How do I establish that relationship? Really hard for general technologists. We tend to be introverts. Here's this person's been in the job for 15 years, and you're saying, well, I may not even meet the person. We may not be in the same office for a while still.
Uh-huh.
How do you do a relationship with them? And I have a video around that, and then the blog post really covers how do you take that relationship and really make it meaningful. I tell a story around Eleanor in the book. She's a marketer who I only knew at the surface, and I had to spend a lot of time understanding what her staff was doing, how they were operating, what their goals were, what their pain points were, who were some people who were ready to partner with me. And then I could have a real conversation with her and saying, here's where technology can help you out.
Hmm.
And I end that blog post saying, look, my job isn't to sell another executive all the time. It's sometimes just to here's the art of the possible. Here are some options.
Yeah.
Here are some
Yeah.
things that you can go do. So I think that's a really important skill of investing enough time to develop relationships. And if you're a CIO, by the way, the reason executives need to invest 40, 50, 60, 70% of their time into relationship building. So
Hmm.
the reason digital trailblazers, hiring them, mentoring them is so important is the CIO isn't going to figure out data science or DevOps or how to improve security. They need their lieutenants to do that,
Right.
right? The CIO has got to be spending time with the CFO and saying, look, here's why you need to stretch the budget right now. Or the
Hmm.
CEO and saying, here's your role in transformation that I need you to step up in. And
Yeah.
they got to set up those relationships. So that's a big part of it. And I'll say the other side of this is learning how to use data to your advantage,
Hmm.
right? I can't come in, you know, just coming in and saying, you know what, I think we should go invest in moving to the cloud because it's going to lower costs and it's going to improve our sustainability footprint, our carbon footprint, and we're going to be able to be more nimble and agile once we're on the cloud. I mean, we've all heard that story
Hmm.
before, but I need some data to back it. And I need to be able to tell that story with data before I share my insights and opinions around it, because more importantly, I need people in the room to look at raw data and come up with their own. So I need to
Yeah.
orchestrate that story with them. So two things I think are really important to be able to use when you're influencing.
I love that. And I mentioned earlier, one of the things I love about the book is the way that you call out the lessons, and then even at the end of the book, recap the lessons, because that gives that really explicit learning to the reader. And here on Status Go, we love to be really explicit about our call to action for our listeners. It's kind of in our name, Status Go. So, what are one or two things that you would tell our listeners to go do tomorrow because they listened to our conversation today?
Well, I would say the first thing is uh, there's a little, I think this is going to help all of you. Those lessons are actually just the start. Okay.
Mhm.
It's only a page, page and a half of every chapter. There's an appendix at the end of it. And you might be asking, where do you go next with this? And I've thought about this. So at the end of every chapter, this, Jeff, there's a URL. I will
Mhm.
tell everybody a secret. It all goes to the same landing page right now. So go right at the end of chapter one, because you're going to see videos. You're going to see added reading material, chapter by chapter. I think every chapter has at least 7 articles that I've written in the past that are the backdrop to the
Mhm.
particular chapter. There's a video I recorded with Ginny around every single chapter. 4 of them are up today. And there's an entire community that we're building so that you can connect with other digital trailblazers.
Oh, that's
So,
awesome.
this is not just a book and a bunch of lessons. This is something that I think you ought to be committed to. I mean, if our careers are going to change dramatically over the next 10 years in very unpredictable ways. And, you asked me, what is a digital trailblazer? A big part of it is continuing and investing in your learning. And I'm here to do that with you.
That is awesome, and action that we can all take. I've checked out some of the resources; they are amazing.
Thank you.
And as you might, as our listeners might be able to tell, I'm a huge fan of Isaac's work, and I think you will be too. If you've not checked his stuff out before, I think you'll really enjoy it. Isaac, I got to thank you for carving out time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. That you're able to do that. And the next time I'm in the New York City, I'll buy you the drink this time because I think you bought last time.
I look, I don't care who buys the drink at this point. I miss seeing you. It's been a long time between COVID and time before that. And,
Yep.
don't wait for another 178 episodes before you bring me back, or wait for me to have another book before I do another one of these. This has been
That's
awesome.
a deal. That's a deal. We will have you back sooner than that, man. I do appreciate it.
Excellent. Hope you pick up the book. It's called Digital Trailblazer. I'm Isaac Sacolick. My website is starcio.com, and you can always find me on Twitter at NYIke, NYIKE.
Awesome. Thanks for putting that in there. And To our listeners, we will make sure that those are in the show notes as well, so that you'll have an easy way to get to them. If you do have a question or you want to learn more, visit intervision.com. As I mentioned, we'll have the links and the contact information. This is Jeff Tunn for Isaac Sacolick. Thank you very much for listening.
You've been listening to the Status Go podcast. You can subscribe on iTunes or get more information at intervision.com. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, find Intervision on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Thank you for listening. Until next time.